It is February 1699, and the 16-year-old Charles XII of Sweden is in the second year of his reign, a year that will go down in history as his wild teenage year. To entertain himself, the king and his entourage of courtiers have taken to riding a sledge down a steep hill. However, despite the sledge gaining high speed, the king is still not satisfied. For the next run down the hill, the king has Count Axel Lilly steer, while he, along with his stable master, Gustav Hård, sits behind. Count Carl Gustav Wrangel and Gustav's brother Axel Hård stand on the runners. The sledge soon picks up considerable speed, causing Axel Lilly to lose control. The whole thing ends in a crash against a pole at the end of the slope. The accident results in injuries for several members of the party, but the king walks away unharmed. Despite the injuries, it was a fun day of youthful indulgence, but what none of them knew at the time was that a year later, in February 1700, the Great Northern War would begin, changing all of their lives forever. Gustav Hård, who had been Charles' riding teacher, was now his stable master, while his younger brother Axel was a chamberlain to the king. When Charles led the army across the Baltic to relieve the city of Narva from a Russian siege, Axel Hård followed the king. He was right next to the king as they rode out onto the snowstorm-filled battlefield. The king had positioned himself on the army's left flank. Soon, they had overrun the Russian positions, and when the Russians were put to flight, many drowned after falling into the freezing river when the overcrowded bridge they were crossing collapsed. Charles then decided to move to the center for a better view of the battlefield. As always, the king moved at a high tempo, and during the ride, both he and Axel Hård ended up in a bog. Hård managed to free himself, but Charles became stuck with water up to his neck. With the help of two Finnish soldiers, Hård managed to pull the king out of the bog, but the king lost one of his boots and his sword. In a show of loyalty, the chamberlain gave his own boot to the king. For years, Axel Hård remained by Charles' side across the campaigns through the Baltics and into Poland. At the famous crossing of the Dwina, Hård followed the king across on the first boats, and he was injured in the fighting. Charles and Axel Hård were close and comfortable with each other, to the extent that Hård could play small pranks on the king. On May 5th, 1704, during a cavalry exercise, Hård sneaked up behind the king, placed his sword at Charles's back, and said, "What would your majesty do now if I were your enemy?" The king, always ready to respond to challenges, quickly turned, drew his pistol, and fired, mistakenly believing it wasn't loaded. But the ramrod remained in place, and it pierced into Hård. It took the chamberlain 3 days to die, leaving the king devastated. For the rest of his life, Charles would spend every 5th of May fasting in repentance in memory of his friend. Though this would not be the last time the king mistakenly injured one of his own. In 1716, during Charles' first Norwegian campaign, a force of 200 Norwegians launched a surprise attack in the morning. Historian Bengt Liljegren, in his biography, Krigarkungen, describes what happened next. The king found himself in a struggle with a Norwegian dragoon and received a saber cut to his left shoulder. However, the many layers of clothing provided some protection, and he escaped with only a scratch. After a while, the Swedes had rallied sufficiently to drive the 200 Norwegians into retreat. Their wounded commander, Colonel Kruse, was captured by Charles's troops. In the confusion after the skirmish, the king accidentally stabbed one of his own soldiers in the back with a rapier. The Swedes had seized the prisoners' white coats to protect themselves from the cold. The terrified soldier turned around, swearing and shouting at the king, "I'm one of your own people." Charles quickly withdrew the rapier, and the soldier was given immediate care. On the king's explicit orders, the soldier was also generously compensated for his pain and suffering. One might speculate that the memory of his friend Axel Hård came to the king's mind once again as he realized his mistake.